Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted to have Dr. Greg Pike here, who is not only a Senior Research Fellow at the BIOS Centre, but is also the Founder-Director of the Adelaide Centre for Bioethics and Culture. And Greg will be speaking to us on the topic, Reproductive Coercion, Are We Missing Something? So over to you, Greg.
Terrific. Thanks, Helen. It's a real pleasure to have the chance again to speak at one of these meetings. And I think what I really like about it is that it's really the opposite of what Margot's talking about. It's people wanting to talk respectfully about issues which are quite complicated and difficult. And I think of many things I've been involved in over the years, this particular subject matter I've found probably some of the most difficult, because it touches on some areas that are deeply sensitive to people. There's a lot of bioethics is like that anyway, but this is in the interpersonal relationship area, and also interfaces with domestic violence and abuse, and some very unpleasant topics. Having said all that, I think it's something that has to be talked about. And so I'm just going to get underway pretty quickly. And I think it'll become evident fairly soon what I really mean when I say, are we missing something? There's one particular element of this jigsaw puzzle which I think has been missing, but we can gain some information about that as we go along. Okay, what's happening here? I've got the down arrow, return, nothing's happening. There we go, okay. So I'm just going to pop all these up quick because I'm going to run out of time if I'm not careful. These are the types of headlines which people may well have seen. This top one from the BBC survey run by Comres suggests that 50% of women of reproductive age have been affected by reproductive coercion. I'm going to come to the definition in a minute, but I think a couple of things we'll notice by looking at that one, plus the one that's headed BBC News down on the right of the screen, is that this particular survey has been widely interpreted as this is a really big problem, number one, but it's primarily about pregnancy promotion. Okay, and just hold that thought for a moment. And so if you look at those other two headlines, one, reproductive coercion, much more prevalent than once thought. So something's happened, which the implication is that we're now gaining some insight into something which has not been evident before. And then the research article down at the bottom there, a huge hidden problem. So the implication is, yes, it's huge. It's something that's been hidden. We don't know much about it. And we need to find more about it, which I think is all good and well. So let's just start with some definitions first off. What is reproductive coercion? This is the kind of definition which is widely used: any deliberate attempt to influence or control a person's reproductive choices or interfere with their reproductive autonomy. Now, there's a few things that are going to spring out of that fairly quickly. That's a broad, and once you start using terms like influence, really broad definition. Because things like influence and control are the types of things which are the stuff of all human relationships of all sorts of levels. So when is it problematic, when is it not, is a really interesting question which we'll try and get to. So generally we think of reproductive coercion in two senses: pregnancy promoting and pregnancy avoiding. So pregnancy promoting might be pressure and threats to become pregnant, interference with contraception, the phenomenon of stealthing, which is secretive condom removal, even withdrawal, withdrawal during intercourse, which was agreed to and was not followed through, would be considered a form of control or coercion, or it comes under the banner of reproductive coercion. And then pregnancy avoiding, well, pressure and threats regarding abortion, sterilisation, or contraceptive use. But the more I think about this, there's a meshing back and forth here, because in the pregnancy promoting bit, there can be pressure and threats regarding contraceptive use itself, and also about sterilisation. In other words, in the opposite sense to the one below, not being sterilised, and coercive behaviours that can cross over into someone not wanting a partner to have an abortion. And that can be quite coercive too. But whether that's a good or a bad thing is another matter. So let's look at some of before we get to the evidence base, and there's a reasonable body of evidence, but I think it's got a whole set of problems to it. I'd like to just talk a little bit around some of the key features of reproductive coercion and some of the difficulties that we have with the definition, what the focus of research has been, and some of the practicalities. First of all, what does it mean to coerce? I've implied already that this is a very broad term, and at this dictionary definition, to cause, to do through pressure or necessity by physical, moral, or intellectual means is one particular definition. The way it tends to be used in the context of reproductive coercion is extremely broad. So the terminology sometimes used in survey questions and in research context is things like, has someone tried to get you pregnant? Right, and that can include pressure of various sorts, through to stronger coercion, through to threats of violence, and so on. So that's one of the difficulties we have. What does it really mean to coerce, and how will people interpret that, and how would we understand it? Because the business of coercion, really, I mean, we're coerced at all sorts of levels to do things by the community that we should do, like, you know, with threats of violence, thrown in jail if you do certain things. So coercion's quite a complex animal. The role of intention. So if someone is intending to promote pregnancy, that intention is sometimes unknown. So the behaviours, let's take, for example, stealthing, secretive condom removal. It's possible that that could entail an intention to promote pregnancy, but it just as much might be simply to avoid condom use, for sexual pleasure, simple as that. So the role of intention has not been dealt with well in this area. There's a bit of a flow back and forth. I would have thought that if you're going to call something reproductive and you're going to call it coercion, it's going to relate to reproduction, pregnancy itself, or the absence of it. But the intention can cross over into sexual coercion, and it becomes a bit more of a complex animal. So the focus of almost all the research has been on pregnancy promotion, very little on pregnancy avoidance by coerced abortion or contraceptive coercion of various means, almost entirely on pregnancy promotion. I think there's an interesting reason for that, I think, that we can come back to. It's almost exclusively on coercion by men. So in an intimate partner relationship, it's nearly all the research is centered around the coercion of women. And it's interesting, I found a comment by someone in this research space. He said, oh, well, yes, the dominant historical understanding used to be the opposite, that men being trapped into marriage or relationship by pregnancy, either by some coercion or by some deception. But that now this is flipped right around. The trouble is, because very little of the research is interested in men, we don't really know. If we're only talking to women, we don't know what the extent of the coercion might be from women towards men. But I'm going to stick mostly with reproductive coercion, as it is primarily understood is men coercing their partners. The other thing to say is that the implication is here that reproductive autonomy is always a good thing and should be absolute. So this doesn't even get questioned. Reproductive autonomy is a good thing. You coerce someone to interfere with that, and it's a bad thing. But I think we can unpackage that a bit further. And I mean, the obvious thing is reproductive autonomy with regard to abortion. Well, that's, you know, that begs the question. The object of the coercion is what counts, not just the simple fact that there's coercion. Surveys typically seek data from one partner only. Now, anyone who's had anything to do with counselling knows that it is an extremely difficult thing to interview one partner in a troubled relationship and get an accurate picture of what's going on. It's not to say that there are lies being told, there sometimes may be, but the reality is that relationships are complicated and messy, particularly when there's abuse involved. And that if you talk to one partner, recall bias, perspective, perception, they can all influence what actually is said. And I think that's just something which needs to be part of a reality check. There are some studies where both parties are spoken to about possible reproductive coercion. The other thing to say is that there are others besides intimate partners who coerce. Typical examples might be historically parents wanting a daughter to adopt out a child to save the family's name, the embarrassment of the pregnancy. So a lot of that coercion can come from parents as well. And in certain cultural contexts, that still happens. So what do the studies tell us? Let's just start here with Miller and Silverman. So Elizabeth Miller and Jay Silverman in 2010 coined the term. So this is all pretty recent stuff. They were the first to use the term reproductive coercion and have remained key players in the field. I think that's important for what will come later. But it's also important to say that they are the ones who developed one of the first survey instruments, which has been widely used. I'll come back to that because I think that's an important point. So this is the kind of, I'm just going to run through some figures just so we can get a feel for this. Lifetime prevalence, just keep in mind that surveys can be conducted looking at the lifetime prevalence. In other words, have you ever experienced reproductive coercion, or recent experience, last 3 months, last 12 months. But of course, once it gets to the level of being reported in the media, a lot of that nuance gets lost. And that's an important point. So here we have between 8 and 30% of US women reported having experienced reproductive coercion at one time or other in their lives. This is a major review of studies by Rollins and Walker. Keeping in mind that those particular figures between 8 and 30%, they're quite broad for some time in life having experienced this, but they also mix the populations of women being surveyed. Sometimes it's a whole of community, sometimes it's not. So if we do look at a whole of community one, this was one done by National Center for, I forget what they're called now, something about domestic violence in the US. 8.6% of US women responded affirmatively to that question about an intimate partner trying to get them pregnant or did not want to use a condom. Important thing about that is that question is about pregnancy promotion only, not pregnancy avoidance. Interestingly, 10.4% of men answered in the affirmative to a similar question that a female partner was trying to get pregnant by coercive means. More recently, we find 2 Australian studies that found figures for lifetime prevalence of 2.3, and I can't see my full screen, I think that's 5.9, 5.9%. But the questions used the term force and also included coerced abortion. So women would be asked a whole series of questions, and if there's a tick for any of them, they're a yes for reproductive coercion. That's how these surveys work. Some are better, and I'll come to one which surprisingly is really quite reasonable in a moment, which is that BBC one of all things. But anyway, so those figures 2.3 and 5.9, they're for lifetime as well, and they are way lower than those other figures, and they include coerced abortion. So there's something really tricky and messy in how this data is coming out. Just to highlight one of the difficulties we have, there was a study by Hill and colleagues, 2019 again, where the women, the headline figure that hit the news was that 1 in 8 US high school girls had experienced reproductive coercion in the previous 3 months. Okay, 1 in 8, that's 12.5%. reproductive coercion in the last 3 months. So that's huge. If that kind of thing was done for a whole population, you'd expect much bigger than 12.5 because that was restricted to 3 months. But if you dig into the study, you find that the population of women being studied, setting aside for the moment that they obviously by definition have to be sexually active, and that's only 40%, or currently sexually active high school girls in America are about 20%. All of these girls were seeking confidential health services at their school. So they're a very specific population. And if they're seeking confidential health services, I suspect they're not at all representative of all girls in US high schools of age 14 to 19 or whatever it is. So those are the sorts of things you have to be really careful with, because the headline figure that pops out in the news of 12.5%, that's cause for alarm if that's three months prevalence for high school girls. And yet it may well be that we're really talking about quite a unique population. Anyway, this is in keeping with what I said about intention earlier on. If you put a question that goes something along the lines of trying to get them pregnant, 3.3% will say yes. But then if you ask them about stealthing, the same sample will say 15.5% would say they experienced stealthing. So if stealthing involved an intention to impregnate, you'd expect the figures to be the same, both 15.5-ish. But what this tells you is that women are making a distinction between what they perceive to be the intention to impregnate from stealthing, which they probably perceive to be the guy just simply doesn't want to use a condom. He's all macho, or he's being stupid, or he just doesn't like the feeling, or as someone told me years ago, it's a bit like having a shower in a raincoat. You wouldn't want to do that. So that's the kind of complexity in that data. I want to just go quickly to the ComRes survey. And because I can't see the right-hand side of my screen, just bear with me a second. I'll get these figures. I'm actually going to move through this bit really quick because I think I'm going to run out of time otherwise. A couple of the headline things. Pressure to have sex without the use of contraception, 35. I'll back up a moment and say that this BBC survey data hits you with the kind of high level figures they're talking about compared with a lot of the academic research. It really does. 50% of women of reproductive age across the whole population, lifetime prevalence of 50%. Wow, I mean, that's huge. So I don't know why these figures are so high, but forced sex without contraception, 20%. Pressure to terminate, so if that's coerced abortion, 15%. 14% pressure to use contraception we didn't want to. Unfortunately, there's a certain ambiguity in these questions, of course, aren't there? Stealthing, pressure to continue. Just quickly down the list, some of these more disturbing ones, physical violence with intention to force a miscarriage, 5%. And that's astronomical, really. 1 in 20 women saying they've been physically assaulted with the intention to end a pregnancy. Threats of harm, and 3% surreptitious popping of an abortion pill in a drink or some other means to induce an abortion. I don't know why these figures are so high. I contacted ComRes and asked them what their pool of subjects was. And this is basically people sign up to be available for surveys of all sorts. Why that may or may not be representative, I simply don't know. I think we can simply say that these figures are extremely high compared with the published literature. Because the thing about the ComRes survey, it's actually done quite well in the sense that it covers all areas that you can think of under the banner of reproductive coercion, unlike a lot of the other academic work. Now, the missing bit that I was talking about at the start, I think, is coerced abortion. And so I'm going to focus a bit more closely on that for the rest of this talk, and hopefully raise a few possibilities as to why I think it might be that coerced abortion has been ignored. But what do we know so far? Well, if we look at those Australian studies, the Cheng study is the 2.3% study. If you look at those 2.3% of women, 80% of them said that there was contraceptive interference, 22% said forced termination, and 20% said forced to become pregnancy, or 9% forced to continue unintended unwanted pregnancy. So the coerced abortion and forced to become pregnant, whether it's pregnancy promoting and the pregnancy avoiding through abortion, are close. They're not hugely different from one another. You could probably say the 20 should be added to the 9, so it's 29% pregnancy promoting, 22% forced terminations. Just leave the contraceptive interference because of those reasons I suggested before. Likewise, in that other study, the 5.9% other Australian study from Queensland, they're not too different. Coercion into pregnancy, coercion to terminate, similar. Interestingly, Silverman himself talked about men involved in an abortion decision, and he found that 8% said that they had sought to prevent abortion, and 4% said that they had sought to compel one. Those are not really huge figures, but it's worth keeping in mind that I suspect it would take a fair bit to fess up to having coerced an abortion. And you'd have to structure that research very carefully to be sure you're getting a straight, honest answer. Qualitative studies show similar numbers reporting coercion into pregnancy versus coercion to terminate. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that coercion to terminate a pregnancy is a real thing. It's been neglected, and there's reason to believe that it is not uncommon, if I can put it that way. But there are other ways besides looking at the literature on reproductive coercion per se to find out if there's pressure and coercion to have an abortion. There are other avenues, if you like, and there's a considerable literature on the reasons that women give for having an abortion. And this goes back quite some distance. Just to say up front that Sullins recently came up with this figure that 15% of abortions were wanted pregnancies. Now, the territory of a wanted pregnancy is the kind of thing where an abortion occurring for a wanted pregnancy suggests there's something pushing that woman into that abortion. There's something, because she wants the pregnancy, but she goes through with the abortion. So that's Sullins's figure for the number of wanted pregnancies. But if we look at survey work by Bancoli, this is a review paper of a lot of stuff which went before. Unfortunately, the question is not always asked about pressure or coercion, but between 12 and 23% of women cite the partner or the husband as the reason for the abortion. So that's kind of suggestive, but doesn't confirm anything. Partner-related reasons, census from 14 countries, 31 to 55%. So partners rate highly whether they're being pressuring or coercive. That data doesn't tell us that because there could be other partner-related reasons like he's a complete dropkick and I don't want to have a child with him. There could be all sorts of reasons. Rue and Co. in 2004 came up with a 64% figure for US women who felt pressured by others in their abortion and 37% of Russian women. Now here's where it gets interesting. If you go to researchers from the Bixby Centre, now the Bixby Centre, I'm going to show my sort of take on this quite quickly. I think that in the area of abortion research, something has happened in the last 10, 15 years whereby some very significant politically active organisations have garnered the research space. And some of this work, so from the Turnaway study, which is part of the Bixby Centre's work, always seem to come out with work that's contrary to a lot of other work, which basically says abortion's great, cutting straight to the chase. I'm really concerned that this is happening in the research space at all, but anyone who's been in it for a while knows it can happen, and it's really deeply disturbing. But they decided that coerced abortion is virtually non-existent. But I think since they are so politically active, that tells you something. I'll go through this really quickly. There's a body of research on the relationship between abortion and intimate partner violence. And in that space, we find that there's an association between the two. So a history of IPV doubled the chances of a second abortion and trebled the chances of 3 or more. But this is an association, this is not causative. This doesn't tell us what came first. And there's not a lot of research that really can tell us that, okay, the violence forced the woman to have the abortion. We don't know that, although we have hints of it. The global rates of IPV in the year prior to abortion vary enormously, but can be up to 30%. So it's quite high. So this relationship between intimate partner violence and reproductive coercion and abortion is quite well established. So this is what I was saying before, women may be seeking an abortion to avoid an ongoing relationship with a violent perpetrator. The pregnancy may have arisen from a sexual coercion or contraceptive sabotage, and the woman doesn't want that pregnancy, so she seeks abortion. Or it could be coerced abortion from the violent partner. There's a few possibilities there. But what we do know from some more recent work by Stevenson is that the relationship between abortion and IPV is bidirectional, which suggests that abortion leads to IPV and IPV leads to abortion. That's about all we can say. But it's a two-way relationship. I find the possibility that abortion could lead to IPV particularly interesting, obviously disturbing, but particularly interesting because that might suggest that there's something in the business of abortion itself, the violence of it, which promotes further violence. That's one thought. Or that the abortion decision was contrary to the wishes of the woman or contrary to the wishes of the guy, and that's led to further interrelational violence. Either's possible. Some of the researchers in this area have, I think, pointed to something which is probably quite a realistic take. And they said, although it is not always determined whether experiencing IPV, sorry, it's hidden from my view again, was a determining factor in the decision to end rather than continue a pregnancy. The findings support the concept that violence can sometimes lead to an initial pregnancy by coercion, rape, sexual assault, or contraceptive sabotage, and to a subsequent termination of pregnancy via coercion. To me, that kind of idea of a violent partner, an abusive partner, seeking control over many aspects of a woman's life is more realistic, so that we could have both coercion into pregnancy, whether intentional and the pregnancy is the intended end or not, and then subsequent termination of pregnancy by coercion. So to me, it doesn't seem too much of a stretch to say there'll be some men who simply want to be abusive and violent and are, and sexually violent, and then they want to be rid of the results of that. That doesn't seem particularly far-fetched. And this is, many will know of David Reardon. When David Reardon was first looking at reproductive coercion, and there was so much talk about men involved in trying to get women pregnant, he said this, he said, my impression is that abusive men are more likely to be so narcissistic that they would rather not have any children around, laying claims on their money, time, or affection of their women. I think that's probably in keeping with the statement above. So just very quickly, so that we can get a handle on what sorts of things women say during qualitative studies. So this work comes from qualitative studies for women who have experienced reproductive coercion. This kind of highlights the complexity. My boyfriend was trying to push me to have an abortion. He said, you won't keep that thing, and he threatened to kill me. Then he said he would kill the child. Several times I felt like I wanted to kill myself. I felt like if I had an abortion, I would have to kill myself. When we first met, he said he wanted a family, wanted to marry me. Then he changed his mind after I was pregnant. So those kind of stories, and I'm just going to skip this next set, and I'm really happy to pass the presentation to anyone who wants to look at it further. But these are just further statements from women in qualitative studies, and you can see, if you look at some of those. Perhaps I will just read one of those. The bottom one, I was kind of excited, but I was so scared to tell my family. I told my mum. Her first response was, "I hope you're getting an abortion. You're going to be a terrible mum." So you might not call that coercive, but the impact of that sort of statement coming from a parent would, I think, be pretty powerful. And so the business of coercion over abortion decisions is one that doesn't necessarily always need to involve physical violence or threat of violence. As these quotes make clear, women can be put in a shockingly difficult situation by statements and behaviours by people close to them that will influence, if not completely coerce them into abortion. So why is coerced abortion neglected in the reproductive coercion space? Why is it? You remember them? At the start, I mentioned Miller and Silverman, the two key researchers in the area who have been involved with a lot of subsequent research. They developed an instrument in 2010 when they first began this work, a survey instrument. And that didn't include coerced abortion in that survey instrument at all. Then a couple of other researchers did start to ask questions about coerced abortion within the context of reproductive coercion. And then Miller and Silverman went back and reworked their survey instrument, still left out coerced abortion, 2017. And a whole host of studies have just routinely used their survey instrument, which leaves out coerced abortion. Obviously, those two Australian studies didn't. They chose their own path in their survey questions. But a lot of research has ignored it. And it's interesting that Miller herself, when interviewed recently, she said, we shouldn't focus on the minutiae of coerced abortion. Jay Silverman says it's not that coerced abortions could not exist, implying that they're extremely rare. They just don't happen. Now, he's the same one who came up with the work with men showing that 4% of them had compelled a woman to have an abortion. And of course, various commentators, coerced abortion is a myth. So the question is why? And this is my sort of take on a few possible responses to that. The first one is that it undermines an ideal of abortion as a free and fully considered choice. Now, I think if you're going to say that reproductive autonomy is fundamentally a good thing, then everything it permits must likewise be fully and freely considered and not in any way itself problematic. And so I think that research which shows that there is a significant problem with coerced abortion undermines this kind of ideal. And I think in many of the pro-choice literature, there is this kind of notion that women are simply making a free and well-considered choice. What's anyone worried about? And that drives then this problem that if you talk about coerced abortions, that could lead to restriction on access to abortion, as it has in the States. In the US, we have various pieces of legislation, some already in place. I think in Michigan was one, but other states being considered at the moment to demand inquiry into the possibility of coercion as part of a legal requirement. And this last one, that I think if reproductive coercion is perceived as all about pregnancy promotion, it's basically saying that a lot of women are getting pregnant against their wishes. And since the public support for abortion is highest for pregnancy arising from force, this is the sort of, I suppose, tinfoil hat thing that I'm doing here, saying that it's actually intentional to leave coerced abortion out of it and to make pregnancy promotion a big problem, because that then means you must have abortion to deal with that. there's a need. If we look at some of these are Australian researchers in reproductive coercion. We have quite a few very active researchers in Australia in this area. And Tasia and Hegarty make this statement. They say that these are contributing factors to reproductive coercion, and they all relate to abortion. And conversely, the protective factors are also related to abortion in the opposite direction. I find that telling. And the reason I find it telling is that if you wanted to deal with men being abusively coercive towards women, you would say, how do we understand why they're doing that? And you would probably say things like, well, there's a problem with lack of respect for women. There's a culture that promotes sexual availability, or cultures that promote male power and dominance. And these are the problems. Or abortion availability in as much as itself, in as much as it acts as an integral fail-safe for men who sexually coerce women, or lack of support for pregnant women. These, to me, seem like what might be the factors causing or contributing to some men being coercive with regard to reproduction. But the fact that abortion access is highlighted, to me, brings in a significant political element to it, into the research space. And I think you could almost almost say that there's probably something similar occurring with the almost complete lack of research of women pressuring men into pregnancy or entrapment, that there's no interest in that whatsoever because it doesn't serve the ideals that some are seeking. So I just want to finish with just a quick comparison to coerced adoption. Now, am I correct that in the UK there have been some significant calls for public apology, government apology? Did I see that? I think I may have seen that. We had a formal apology here in Australia to women who'd had children forcibly removed effectively, or women coerced into adoption. So there was a whole cultural setting, many of you are aware of, that went right through to the 80s, where a unwanted pregnancy was dealt with by coerced adoption. So not only unmarried, but primarily unmarried girls were taken away from their families very quickly and put in institutions where they had the child secretively, and the child was removed from them at birth. Some very unpleasant things happened. And if you look at the incidence of adoption overall and how it's declined from its peak in the 70s to where it is now, it's almost a mirror image of the rise of abortion. And I know association correlation doesn't equal causation, but I just wonder if the historical means of dealing with a problem pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy, was adoption, often coerced. Now it's abortion. And that's why we've seen those two curves cross over, as it were. So we had quite a process here in Australia that resulted in the national government policy apology in 2013, and I'm sure I saw similar calls in the UK and Canada for similar things having happened there. It is a little interesting that something similar hasn't happened in the US. There seemed to be a culture which was quite different, far more accepting of unwed pregnant girls, particularly in the Black community, where those girls did not have their children adopted out, but were more embraced by their families, which is interesting. So, look, I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully I've left enough time for a few questions. I know it's been a bit of a whip through, but I'll be really happy to have a go at questions if anyone has one.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that very, very interesting presentation. And as you say, you went through a lot of things quite fast, but I've had the opportunity to read the paper, and it's certainly well worth a read. Would anyone like to kick off the discussion?
Helen, it's Patricia Casey here. Can you hear me?
Oh, hello, Patricia. On my computer, there's some distortion, but
Yeah, me too.
maybe that's only my computer. If it's too bad, just put it in the chat.
I can't see you because there isn't a chat facility coming up on my screen.
Oh dear, that's
at the moment.
So nothing at the bottom of the page.
And I can't. Can you put on the camera, because I can't, it's not allowing me to turn on my camera.
It must be your computer settings, I think. I think I've had that same kind of thing myself, but I'm not sure we can do that remotely, unfortunately.
No, there is nothing I can do to switch on their camera.
But look, have a go asking, and we'll see if we can hear.
Right. My stories are really anecdotal, Greg. I've turned on the camera now. Sorry, the problems at my end. I've turned up two anecdotes. A few years ago, I'm a psychiatrist working in Dublin, and I had a lady referred to me, and she was referred, according to the GP letter, with depression. But when I actually saw her, her daughter had become pregnant. She was a student, and her mother coerced her into having an abortion. She said they would not pay for her an abortion. So her daughter reluctantly had an abortion, and her mother then developed a depressive illness. She was obviously exceedingly guilty about what had happened. She couldn't forgive herself for what she had done to her daughter and her daughter's baby. Grandmother, who was responsible for the loss through abortion of her grandchild, deals with all of that. So it was clinically challenging. But thankfully, it worked out in the sense that she began to adjust to what had happened and to integrate her guilt and the wrongness of what she had done, and to live with that, which is the best, I think, that you can hope for in these circumstances. That's just an observation. The second thing is in relation to the point, Greg, and by the way, your talk was really, really good. Thank you. It was really very clear. It was interesting what you said about this idea that it's abortion facilitating, and that's why the emphasis is on the coercion of women to become pregnant rather than and not to have abortions, rather than the other way around. And I'm involved in a case with a law firm in the US at the moment who are trying to bring a case in a state where there are active pregnancy centers, and Planned Parenthood are trying to have them shut down. And they're trying to use the law to do that. And one of the points that we made in the submissions in this case was that they do not assess coercion in abortion clinics. They do not assess for coercion to have an abortion because of the way in which the so-called counselling is carried out. It's done by it's not done by a professional. They go to the abortion clinic or they ring up the abortion clinic. It's assumed they want an abortion. And so all the questioning is around having the abortion, that rather than examining in any depth at all whether the woman wants an abortion, whether intimate partner violence is involved, whether rape may have been involved, and that particularly concerns minors. So this is an ongoing case in one of the states in the US, and the test for coercion is central to the case, and the absence of testing for coercion is central to the case.
Thank you. So in a naive way, I would have thought that if you were opposed to reproductive coercion, it should be a bit of a no-brainer that you'd be happy with screening for abortion coercion. But there's a certain terror in the pro-choice mindset about anything possibly which could be even perceived as a hindrance. But I fail to see how a screen for coercion can be problematic. I just don't. I don't see how it can be a problem to do that. There's plenty of talk of implementing screens for reproductive coercion, generally in terms of pregnancy promotion. Why could it not simply include coercion into abortion? I find the almost bloody-mindedness of the opposition to that astounding. But I guess that's what we're dealing with. Yeah.
Yes, in this country, sometimes the abortion clinics will say, "Oh, we always interview the woman by herself, not with her partner," you know, in case there's some kind of coercion to abort involved. So you do get this said, but then we have to look at telemedicine abortion, you know, where it's impossible to tell whether there's the woman is really alone in her own room, or whether someone's standing right beside her saying, do it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting with the rise of medication abortions. As well, I was intrigued to see that BBC last question they asked, and a 3% incidence of being slipped an abortion pill. The high availability of medication abortions and who can obtain the pills and how you can obtain them means that sort of problem is facilitated. And the same with the whole telemedicine thing, where it's easy to, and I think there was a sting operation, wasn't there? Forgotten who did that now. Was that a UK sting with women pretending to be pregnant and wanting abortion medication, and there was a whole series.
I think so. Yeah,
I think that was a UK thing, and that they had no difficulty getting them just popped in the post and straight out. So it would not be difficult at all to get a hold of that medication. And then whoever is getting hold of that medication, if you don't know who that is and you've got no way of cross-checking who it is, it'd be very hard to track, and very easy for someone to use it in a coercive way or a deceptive way. So yeah, I think the loosening of the rules that's happened during COVID. I'm not sure of the political situation in the UK now, whether that's continuing, the telemedicine thing. Is that continuing?
It seems to be,
yeah. Well, I think that's probably set in place now.
I mean, there was a case just recently in the UK of the lover of someone who had a girlfriend obtained abortion pills not to use herself, but to use for the girlfriend of her lover. But yes, I don't know the details, but that's certainly an ongoing court case, I believe.
Yeah. I think one of the more difficult questions is that if a young woman comes in and you do have a coercion tool to screen, a screening tool, what you actually do with that and how it's managed from that point onwards could be incredibly difficult. Because if you do have a coercive and somewhat dangerous male partner who's abusive, what do you do if that woman does not agree to leave that relationship and go straight back to that relationship? If coercion's been identified and she's said that, and then it's evident that what she has said has resulted in some sort of investigation, and it puts her at risk with that partner. And I think that's the dilemma with the whole domestic violence thing, an abusive partner, is how I just don't know how you do that. And in the worst cases, it's, you know, if a woman really does want to get away, then that does provide you with the opportunity to help her out of that relationship. But if she doesn't, yeah, what do you do?
Becomes hopefully more appreciated, the reality of coerced abortion, that pregnancy centres and indeed abortion facilities, if aborters, if they're of a mind to, will develop policies around it. It's a bit like, you know, what do you do if somebody tells you they have been sexually abused? How do you treat that? Who do you disclose it to? What are the parameters to disclosure? So I think as people, if they do become more aware of this, the organizations will develop thoughtful policies over time. I mean, at the moment, it sounds overwhelming, you know. If I had a woman into me in the morning saying she was being coerced into an abortion, I really wouldn't know what to do, you know, who to refer. The person is violent, suggested you report to the RD, but she can refuse to if she's got capacity. So all appears to be at the moment, but I think ultimately, you know, we could find a way around it.
Well, I suppose the abortion provider could be informed if you knew where she was scheduled to have it. I mean that's a possibility if you think a crime's happening. But it's very, very difficult.
Yes, I mean, if a crime is committed, if somebody has been violent, one is supposed to report the crime. It's in Ireland, at any rate, it's illegal. It's a crime not to report the crime. So I presume it's the same in the UK. I don't know about Australia, but so I think if a partner has been violent, ideally it should come from the woman herself. But if not, I think the doctor may have a duty to respond. But then the problem is the police may refuse to become involved if the woman herself doesn't. That happens with child sexual abuse all the time, that we're supposed to report child sexual abuse, but a woman who was sexually abused as a child refuses to cooperate. That's it. The police will not become involved.
I suppose I'm just wondering whether at least the clinic would delay things if you told the clinic, you know, I think there's a criminal pressure on this woman, you know, that puts them in a difficult situation. But I just don't know.
I think the difficulty is a lot of this, there does seem to be a correlation with domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And at least in Scotland, if you compare the statistics of cases that are actually brought to the police versus cases that are never brought to the police, it's only about 10% of domestic violence cases that actually get brought forward. When there's been kind of Ipsos Mori polls and stuff within Scotland, they've discovered that there's a situation where about 90% of domestic violence cases never actually get reported to the police by anybody. And if that's similar in regards to reproductive coercion and being pressured into having an abortion, if there's any kind of similar numbers there, it's maybe unrealistic to expect the women to be in a position to feel confident enough to report it to the police, even if it is a crime.
Mm.
And the other thing is, a lot of the coercion may not even meet the threshold of what's considered a crime, and it's a lot of it's sort of perhaps quite subtle, and or it doesn't necessarily involve threats of physical violence. So it might be a little bit hard to quantify that. Let the abortion provider know this is happening. What do I do with this information? Is it sufficient for us to put things on pause? It's a very tricky area.
Yes.
It is. I think what you've highlighted there about thresholds is something in this whole field which is very tricky, because if as I think is happening with the pregnancy promoting behaviours, the threshold is set very low. In other words, any pressure to promote pregnancy, you see kind of terminology like, as I think I showed in the questionnaire, trying to get you pregnant. Now, when does trying to get someone pregnant cross a threshold beyond what is normally happening between couples back and forth? I know a couple where she desperately wanted a child. He quite hadn't grown up, and he didn't want a child. It got to the point where she left him for another, and she threatened to leave lots of times on these grounds. And she left him, the marriage dissolved, and she found another guy and married, and he was devastated. So you could say that there was an attempt from her part to coerce him into a pregnancy, and that resulted in a breakup, but it was not the kind of territory that I think is the rightful place for any authority to participate in. It's the complex interrelational thing. And so in what I presented, I think I showed some work by Jay Silverman where 8% of men had tried to stop an abortion and 4% had tried to compel one. If you look at the detail of the way that was framed, the question asked was, first of those men was there a disagreement about the abortion? Now, if you frame things in terms of disagreement, again, you're not in the territory of intervention, because this is the sort of stuff which happens between couples. But of course, there are times when it crosses that threshold, but trying to find that threshold is tricky for a couple of reasons. One, we've already sort of looked at. The other reason is that whilst I might say, okay, the net is cast very broad for the incidence of reproductive coercion where it's pregnancy promoting, and we talk about pressure or trying to get pregnant and those sorts of terminology. The point is that when it comes to the flip side, which is the coerced abortion, then if we're going to be consistent, we have to use that same low threshold, which is pressure, and at some point we'll cross a line. So that if we set the standard a bit higher into the sort of more abusive and dangerous territory of controlling and coercive behaviours, which are really getting problematic, then we might find that the pregnancy promoting behaviours drop very significantly. The incidence of them drops very significantly, just as maybe even some of that abortion, what's called abortion coercion, drops significantly. So it's kind of a double-edged sword as to how you talk about this, because if I want to suggest that coerced abortion is something that's been forgotten, then I can easily use the strategy by most reproductive coercion people to set the threshold really low. And then it gets into that territory where some of it is disagreement between couples. And it might not actually hit that threshold. And that I think is the problematic thing in a lot of this work, is when that threshold is reached. And most of the survey work is so ill done and does not really deal with that question. And I think that's partly why we will see these massive headline figures of reproductive coercion out of control. 50% of women 12% of schoolgirls in the last, we'll see these very high figures when that threshold's set very low. But if we similarly set it low for coerced abortion, which we should fairly do, we'll find also figures very high. But like I said, it cuts two ways. I hope that made sense.
Yep. Yes, if you were structuring a questionnaire on this, what would you ask?
Okay. Now you put me on the spot. I suppose I'm not even sure that you can do it with questionnaires. I guess that's the thing. It's very hard, because the reason I say that is that many of the women in the adoption, the area of adopting out unmarried women adopting out a child. In Australia, in some of the work done on that, women were describing themselves as being forced to adopt out a child because of the culture. So how do you frame questions when people will use words like force that involves no physicality? And I think this is a bigger problem, because I think in the domestic violence area, we have a problem here too, because that threshold for the use of the word violence. So I'll just read you something that popped out, if I can find it. Here's something from now she's head of, where are we? Sorry, just bear with me a sec. Ruth Glenn, President and CEO of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence in the US, said this: the first thing to recognise when talking to a woman about these matters is, do you feel like you're being forced to have children? Do you feel like you're being forced to be pregnant? Do you feel like there has been violence, particularly when your partner says, I'd love to have children with you, and you have to take control of your body and say, I don't think I'm ready. And there's this subtle pressure to have children. Now, here's the use of the word violence, right, in a context like that. So we have a lot of, there's problem with the terminology and how it's defined and pinned down. And I think that's the real difficulty we have. If we're in the territory of using the word like force to talk about cultural pressures, then, we've got a real problem. So you almost have to frame questions that talk about what is the nature of the force and the pressure, or the pressure or the force, the coercion, all lumped together, that you're talking about. And I don't know quite how you do that, but I think that's going to be one of the enduring problems of survey work, along with all the others which exist in this space. So look, I know that doesn't help, but what I guess I'm saying is we need to know what terms mean. We need to know what words mean.
Yes.
And we need to know that the person hearing knows what that word means, because they'll be so influenced by perceptions and how they feel that the objective nature of what's gone on can be very difficult to get to. So I'm sorry.
No, thank you. That's
don't really have a,
I was just wondering whether perhaps the word threat, but then with a whole lot of potential tick boxes.
yeah,
Has anyone threatened you to harm you physically? Has anyone threatened to leave the relationship or whatever? So it's to make, because I think threat is a fairly strong word.
And you can pin it down to something. You can pin it down to some action or a threat of something. That's true. In fact, there's some work where the threat of leaving a relationship threat of abandonment, or did he threaten to have a child with someone else? But even then, it's difficult territory, because people can have meaningful threats which never carried through, and ones which are vacuous, and you know that that person's being stupid.
But also, as you said, there's sort of the complexities of relationships. For example, let's say, there's long-term boyfriend or girlfriend, and the woman might say, well, I feel like I'm treading water here. You still won't agree to have a child. I'm getting older. If you don't agree, I'm off. You might say, well, she's entitled to do that.
Exactly, perfectly normal conversation you'd expect to happen between couples.
Yeah.
No, I know, and I suppose the concern with a lot of this is that we're capturing some of that in the survey questions. The way they're structured, we're capturing some of that normal interactive stuff between couples. So yeah, it's going to need a lot more careful thought to pin down, and I think it gets down to qualified counsellors, agreeing that we've got a problem of some sort, setting in place the requirement for counselling before coming in for an abortion, say, and that you put it down to the astute questioning of a trained person as to figure out if there's something really wrong here.
Any more questions or comments? Well, Greg, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation and discussion, and we've got a lot to think about. I think many of us might have thought the whole area was a lot simpler than it was, and thank you very much for teasing out all the aspects of it, and we're very grateful to you.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you very
Goodbye,
much.
All the best, everybody.
You too.
Bye. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.